His book, the latest, which I'm holding here in my hand, A Thousand Ways to Die, is his first book and available now. Tremaine Lee, it's always a pleasure to see you, brother. Welcome to the show.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, I enjoyed. I was privileged enough to be able to attend your book launch over the weekend. It was phenomenal. Congratulations to you. You could tell that room was full of so much love and appreciation for your work and how you show up for us. That it was really nice to be in that space to celebrate the work that you've accomplished. This book, A Thousand Ways to Die. I got to be honest with you. I was listening to it and reading it at the same time because I think, as I shared with you, I hate talking to people about books that I have not read. Tremaine, my lord, the way you weave your personal story into this topic, where you're exploring the role and the life cycle of the gun and its ability to impact our lives, absolutely phenomenal. Talk to us about the genesis for this book, A Thousand Ways to Die, the true cost of violence on Black life in America. What was the genesis of this book for you?
Thank you so much for this conversation. These are tough conversations to have, but I think they are necessary. So thank you for providing an opportunity to have this conversation. So in so many ways, I know authors will say that they poured their lives onto the page. This really does feel like I opened my chest up and just poured my entire self onto these pages. But really, the earliest seeds of this book were planted back in 2003 when I was an intern at the Philadelphia Daily News. And I was covering the story of a young man named Kevin Johnson, who was shot and paralyzed during a robbery attempt. These young guys were trying to rob him for his Allen Iverson jersey, and in the process, shot him in the back of the neck. And so I make my way into his hospital room, and I expected to find a young man completely shattered, right, completely broken. And in some ways, I did find that. He was paralyzed. His body would never be the same. But he had this buoyancy about him, and he had this big smile, and he talked about his dreams of one day walking again, and how his literal dreams of him playing basketball, he could feel every sensation as if he still had full command of his body.
Mm.
And I'm listening to him speak and seeing his big old smile. And I look across the bed and I find his mother's eyes filled with tears. And we both have this moment where we realize he will never walk again. But then she started to talk about these costs that I had never fully considered when someone is shot. He needed a special wheelchair. He needed a special van. He needed to have a new ramp on their row home in North Philly. They needed to have the doors widened. They needed a new electrical outlet for the breathing machine to keep him alive.
Mm.
All of these extraordinary financial costs beyond the cost that Kevin paid of his mobility and any future that he'd hoped.
Mm.
And so I started to think to myself, you know what? People don't care about the Kevin Johnsons of the world, but maybe, and this is like a kind of a cynical approach, but I said, you know what? Maybe they'll care about the actual dollar amount we're all paying, because most people who are injured by gunfire don't have private insurance.
Right.
The public, we're paying for it. And so I said, you know what? I'm gonna rope them in about the true dollar cost, and then get to the cost that we pay, every single day. And so I was pitching that story, and I couldn't get any traction until I finally got a book deal in 2015. So I'm writing this story called $1 Million Bullets: The True Cost of Gun Violence, right? And then 2 years in, I have a heart attack. And facing my own mortality, it forced me to widen the aperture on what violence really is and how Black people in this country experience violence. And so there's the blood clot and the bullet, and both are sparked from these very American impulses that we experience, right? And so it changed the entire trajectory of what I was doing, but it also forced me to look within to what I was carrying, what was truly bearing down on my heart.
And Tremaine, you talk very openly in the book about your heart attack, which at 38 years old, I think was a shock to everybody who knew you.
Yeah.
It was definitely a like, what the hell? Like, what are you talking about? But you even retell this in the pages of the book, your entire professional career has been focused on the impact of death, the impact of the gun in many ways, on Black lives. And at a certain point, you talk about conversations between you and your beautiful baby Nola. Shout out to Nola. And you talk about her inquisitive nature, the question she was asking about the heart attack. You're very young at this point. You're literally not even 40 years old, and she's asking you about what would have happened had you not been saved in that moment, and would you have died? And in your explanation to her and her demand to know why, you at that point introduced the reader to the total cost of your coverage of your career and how that was also trapped in your body as much as was the story of how the gun has shaped your family. Give us a sense as to the weathering effect,
Yeah.
that the hyperattention you have had to pay as a result of your career, the hyperattention you've had to pay on the cost of violence on Black lives, how that not only impacted you and helped, from my belief, from what I was reading in the book, helped to contribute to that heart attack, but also really picked up on some of the things that you had been carrying as part of your generational trauma as a result of how the gun had impacted your family directly.
That's right. Many of us have heard about this book, The Body Keeps the Score, and
Yeah.
how we're holding pieces of everything we experience. And to that point, most of my career had been covering Black death and survival, right? As a police reporter in cities all across the country, Trenton and Philly, New Orleans and New York. And, when I was a young reporter, I had like a police scanner over my shoulder, and I would hear certain codes, which meant gunfire, stabbings, beatings, whatever it would be. And I would rush to the scene, and I would often find a young man who looks just like me, the same sneakers as me, dressed like me when I'm off the clock. And then I'd see the pain in his family's eyes, and I'd have to grapple with that kind of whirlwind of emotional chaos. And I would tell hundreds of those stories. And each time it was as if I was taking a little piece of ribbon or a little shard, and I'm packing it inside of me. I can still see their faces now, and the ways that I described them, and their last conversations, and the yearbook pictures, and all of that. And so I was carrying the very real, pain of other people, and Black people especially, and finding in their families all that hurt and pain.
Mm.
And so I've been doing that for 12, 13 years at that point. But then there's also a family history going back 100 years to the Jim Crow South,
Right.
with the first murder in my family, which would be the first of many, visiting my family almost every generation, from 1920s, the 50s, the 70s, the 90s, time and again. And so what was really bearing down on my heart was the true weight of Black death,
Mm.
and the broad ripples. And so I was experiencing other people's pain and hurt. And I was always mission driven. So I was beyond empathy. These are my people. This is my community. And I wanted to shine light on the realities of the way we experience violence in this country. Um, and so all of that packed in. And when I was young, especially, now it's different. But I didn't have a true sense of how to process in real time the ache of Black death, let alone finally understanding what my family has lost. And so growing up, I was always aware of my grandfather's murder. He was killed in 1976. My grandparents owned an apartment in Camden, New Jersey, and some guy came to rent the apartment and left a deposit, and then just disappeared. He came back, won his money back, and my grandfather told him, it's non-refundable, right? I'll see you in court. A court date was actually set. The
Mm.
guy came back and murdered my grandfather. And so growing up, hearing the stories of Grandpa Horace from my mother and my aunts and uncles, I understood in some way, like a cutout portrait, like the big gap, right? And everybody loved him. I understood that. But then I had to go back to the Jim Crow South, where my grandmother's 12-year-old brother was murdered in a sundown town. And then in the 50s, once we joined the Great Migration after that killing, another by a state trooper, right?
Mm.
And then my grandfather, and then my stepbrother in the early 90s, mid 90s. And so what does it mean to carry that weight, right? What is the collective trauma, let alone the trauma that we harbor within us, that we inherit, right? The silent violence of the stress and weight and pressure.
Right. As I was reading it, I found my mind coming back to a number of lessons that I had learned back when I was studying grieving in other cultures and in other societies. And I can't remember what book it was, so don't ask me to cite it, but there was a passage that I will never forget reading where it talked about the warriors in a society, right? And we're talking about indigenous African cultures. And when the warriors would go out and engage in the acts of warfare, there was something that the community recognized that was happening spiritually in that moment, right? When you are taking the life of someone out of political issues, out of anger, whatever it is, there is something spiritual that happens. And before those warriors could come back home, greet their families, be welcomed back into the village, they had to go through a cleansing. They had to go through some
Mm-hmm.
sort of initiation, some sort of ritual that would allow them to release the spiritual weight of what they had just participated in. And it's similar to hunters with food. Like in a lot of indigenous cultures, there is a series of prayers and sort of processes and rituals that you engage in, recognizing that the taking of a life, for whatever reason, is the taking of a life. And what I was thinking about, Tremaine, as I was reading the book, thinking about your family and thinking about all of this, because you tell the story so powerfully, and it feels like I could see your grandfather. I could see him as he's stumbling backwards, as that scene unfolds. I can see the horror in your grandmother's face. And as I was thinking about that and thinking about the weight that you had already discussed as it pertains to what was contributing to your heart attack, it
Mhm.
felt to me like for so many of us, we as Black people are exposed to death. We are exposed to violence and exposed to harm without the without any ancestral knowledge about how to ensure that our lives are not similarly trapped by those things, and without a way of releasing that pain so that the weathering becomes compounded. I don't know how that lands for you, but I just, because you take us through every single generation and we see how the gun has impacted there, I wonder what sense of that you can make.
Everything you said right there, I've been thinking about it as a kind of psychic residue of
Mm,
violence that certainly we haven't been able to like wipe it off our shoulders and wash it off, because there is the community kind of violence that we've become accustomed to from a range of circumstances in which we move through this country, right? But there also is the historic residue. And so there is the exposures to violence that we've suffered at the hands of a white supremacist society from the very beginning. But also, I think there is a psychic tangle with the actual gun itself. And so I address in the early part of the book, and this could have honestly could be a whole book in itself, but
yeah.
the guns for slave
Yes.
cycle,
Yes.
in which European powers often would only trade with regional African powers with guns for bodies. And the idea that from the very beginning, our introduction to the hell of the Western world was bound to the actual gun. And then we go on to experience the gun as a cudgel, right? If we
Mm,
ever dare to be too free, the actual violence that it takes to keep this society bound and keep it stratified and keep the white supremacist powers in power. We've experienced all of that without a true cleansing. And then for many of us, turning to this Norwegian white guy, blonde hair, blue eyes, without the language to eat the actual language to articulate our pain and our hopes and our dreams and our cleansing. And then we arrive in conditions we'd hope would be this promised land, other kinds of violence bounding us, right? And we haven't found a way. To your point, I think that's what we're carrying, and we're twisted and bound without any way to really free ourselves.
part of the psychic residue that you describe, and I got to say thank you for this particular passage, because you put into words something that I think makes a lot of us uncomfortable, which is that you're describing when your experience going to the door of no return. You describe sort of this trip that your family takes with a number of other Black folk from this country, and you talk about what it was like to be in that moment, the psychic experience. I wouldn't say psychic, the metaphysical might be a better
Yeah.
word, experience that you have in that moment, which you describe so beautifully. And one of the things that you describe in there as you're talking about the slave gun trade is that you say that you're angry. And this isn't a direct quote, but you talk about the fact that your anger wasn't just at the European enslavers, but also the African ancestors who were participants in that gun slave cycle, whether they were knowing or unknowing. And I think sometimes we struggle with being able to name that and being able to articulate that, but it is an accurate thing. Like, right, there were
Yeah.
debates happening throughout the continent of Africa. Should we be participating in this? Should we not? Can you sort of, for those who are new to the phrase gun slave cycle, talk to us about what that cycle is and some of the debate that we know it generated amongst people who were either willing or unwilling participants therein?
Yeah, the guns for slave cycle, I think of there were a few things that surprised me as I'm writing and researching and reporting this story. And the guns for slave cycle, so in the 18th century, as gun technology is rising, like we're getting very close to what we have today with flintlock rifles, the technology around the firing of a bullet or a round it's eerily similar to what it is now, right? The early predecessors. But as technology is rising, and the one thing that Europeans did really well is keep records. And so we see as the slave trade is rising, the number of guns and gunpowder going to what they call the slave coast of West Africa was extraordinary. And the idea wasn't just to trade guns for humans, that was part of it. But there was this other impulse to destabilize the region. And so you had European powers who were applying various regional powers with guns and gunpowder to create war, to create more enslaved people. It wasn't as if we were just some surplus humans and the Europeans said, oh, we need labor. There's this untapped labor force. Let's invite them over. They were creating the instability. But the debate ends up being, and this is hard for us as Black Americans to reconcile because we do romanticize from whence we came and the motherland. And even on the continent, we weren't always seen as the same peoples. And so part of it is, you know what, we'll round up our prisoners of war, we will exploit their desire. But then there was also, I think, we have to understand this isn't letting anyone off the, from accountability, because I also am still mad at these co-conspirators.
Right.
But these white men with their guns and their war and their willingness to deploy unseen amounts of violence with their cannons and their guns that they are developing, and they're the harbors of this violence.
Mm.
How do you, are they ever a good faith partner? Right. So
Mm.
under what duress? And
Right.
again, I think that's, again, I don't also want to take accountability off the shoulders of these African co-conspirators.
Well,
Um,
but we see how American duress works right now. Like we see how we see what they do right now, and then we have the reality that the slavery that existed prior to Europeans remixing it and turning it into chattel slavery was fundamentally different. So we can recognize the limitations of it. I needed to say thank you for voicing that, because sometimes we get the romanticization of it can sometimes throw us off our analytical steps, and we need to be able to say no, there was some willful participation here, and that's important because we still see today how African can be turned against African, right? And keeping in mind, y'all, we were not Africans at that time. We were not black. Might be Dahomey. You might be Hausa. But there was no such thing as black until Europeans created chattel slavery and a version of slavery that had never existed before, where the enslaved lost all rights to humanity and a capacity to advocate or advance themselves in any meaningful way. And Tremaine, the challenge I'm having is because I've been talking with my kids about, or my youngest, about the same age as Nola. I've been talking with her a lot about choices, right? Decisions. And, B and I, we had these conversations in the household on a regular basis. And one of the things that she is sort of grappling with is, how did the gun come to be? And because I've explained to her that we had gunpowder for a long time before we had the gun. And I
yeah,
think people don't necessarily realize that there were decisions that were made to take a resource that had been abundant, gunpowder, fireworks, and there are all sorts of reasons to have gunpowder. But there was something that motivated the creation of this handheld weapon of mass destruction. And that,
yeah,
to me, singularly is at the heart of what has destabilized the continent of Africa. It is what has allowed for the empowerment of the West, we talk about the global South, the global North, and the global West to really be dominant in ways and spaces that would allow them to annihilate any group of human beings that they did not value in the way that they valued themselves. And I'm wondering if we have the capacity to factor that into our current debates about gun violence in this society, in light of what we all saw happening, multiple shootings that have happened in the
yeah.
past several weeks. Some of them have gotten a whole lot more attention than others. And I'm wondering if that sort of analysis would be helpful for people to consider as we determine what direction this country should go in when it comes to gun violence prevention.
That's a huge idea, and I think it's one that is appropriate, but I think we have to keep it in a certain kind of context. I think
Mm-hmm.
the context that makes sense, especially for Black people trying to understand how we got here.
Mm.
It's not just the gunpowder that could have been used for fireworks, and then you deploy it into a weapon that could be used for hunting. I think it's a combination of the technology hitting a point where there are peoples who think they are closer to God, and the
Ooh.
rest of us are something else, right? And
Ooh.
so the willingness to use violence and take life because you are, they believe, a direct line to God. And we are an aberration to that. And I think no further than 2 weeks ago, when the president of the United States, amid the threat of occupying Black cities, said it doesn't matter whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 2 years, these people were born to be criminal.
Right.
Right? There's an innate otherness in us. There's an innate criminality and violence in us. So you can do anything to bring us to heel. And so when we have those kind of ideas and those notions of godliness and what else, you can go across the entire world armed with the ability to take life at scale without any problem and justify it because of God and justify it because we're savages and justify it for every reason. And we still see at the threat of the deployment of an armed force,
That's right.
right, to bring us under control. And I think when we think about the assassination that we saw of their far right wing leader,
Mm-hmm.
America secretes violence from its pores, and this is more of the same. Now, of course, it's typically directed in certain spaces, but you cannot exist in such a violent society without a lashing at those who are also advocating the pulling of the trigger. Lest we forget, he said the cost to liberty is some gun death. A lot of us believe that cost is way too high. I'd
Mm.
still argue to this day, even in light of that killing, the cost is simply too high. But again, we have a nation bound in that kind of perverted sense of godliness. It's
Hmm.
it's insane, but this is this world which we exist.